The coffee was still steaming in my cup when my son-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said the words that would change everything. "You're just an old man waiting to fade, Robert. Nobody needs your opinions anymore." My daughter Sarah sat there, silent as a church mouse, stirring her oatmeal like nothing had happened. That was the moment I realized I'd been living in a house where I was nothing more than furniture, expensive furniture they tolerated because I paid the mortgage. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been dismissed by someone half your age who thinks wisdom comes with a college degree instead of decades of hard living, then you need to hear this story. Because what happened next will shock you. Hit that subscribe button right now, because I'm about to tell you how I turned the tables on everyone who thought Robert Mitchell was done fighting. I'm 64 years old, and until that Tuesday morning in September, I thought I was living the good life. My wife Margaret had passed 3 years earlier, and Sarah convinced me to sell the family home and move in with her and her husband Derek in their sprawling suburban house in Denver. "It'll be perfect, Dad," she'd said. "We have that big guest wing, and you won't have to worry about maintaining a house anymore." What she didn't mention was that Derek saw me as a walking ATM with an expiration date. Derek Callahan. Even his name sounds like trouble, doesn't it? 6'2", perfectly styled hair, one of those finance guys who wears $1,000 suits to work and thinks his MBA from Colorado State makes him God's gift to business. He'd married my Sarah 5 years earlier, and I'd walked her down the aisle with a smile on my face, thinking I was gaining a son. What I really gained was a parasite. The signs had been there for months, but I'd ignored them. The way he'd interrupt me mid-sentence when I was talking to Sarah. How he'd roll his eyes when I'd share stories about my 30 years running Mitchell's hardware store. The condescending smile when I'd offer advice about anything, finances, home repairs, life in general. But I'd brushed it off. I told myself he was just young, that he'd grow out of it, that family was family. That morning, I'd made the mistake of commenting on their breakfast routine. Sarah was rushing around, trying to get their 8-year-old son Tommy ready for school while Derek sat there scrolling through his phone like he was watching the stock market crash in real time. "You know," I said, folding my newspaper, "when Sarah was Tommy's age, Margaret and I made sure we sat down together every morning. Family time was sacred." Derek didn't even look up from his phone. "Times changed, Robert. Some of us have real jobs that require attention." The sting of that comment should have been my first warning. I'd sold my hardware store for $1.2 million 3 years ago. I'd worked 6 days a week for 3 decades, built something from nothing, employed 12 people, and was a cornerstone of my community. But to Derek, because I wasn't shuffling papers in a glass tower downtown, I didn't have a real job. "I'm just saying," I continued, keeping my voice level, "maybe Tommy would benefit from." That's when he dropped his phone on the table with a loud clack and looked at me with those cold blue eyes. "Robert, let me explain something to you. This is 2024, not 1985. The world has moved on from your quaint little small-town values. You're just an old man waiting to fade, and nobody needs your opinions anymore. Sarah and I will raise our son the way we see fit." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock on the kitchen wall ticking, the coffee maker gurgling, Tommy's cartoon playing in the living room. But what I couldn't hear was my daughter defending me. Sarah just sat there, her spoon moving in slow circles through her oatmeal, like she was trying to disappear into the bowl. "Sarah?" I said quietly. She finally looked up, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before: shame. Not shame at Derek's words, but shame at me. Like I was some embarrassing relative who'd overstayed his welcome at a dinner party. "Dad," she said softly, "Derek's just stressed about work. Maybe it would be better if we didn't discuss parenting at breakfast." And there it was. My own daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike, who I'd walked down the aisle, who I'd supported through college and her difficult divorce from her first husband, was choosing him over me. In that moment, I felt something crack inside my chest, and I realized it wasn't heartbreak. It was the sound of my patience finally snapping. I stood up slowly, my knees creaking like old hinges, and looked at both of them. Derek had already gone back to his phone, dismissing me like I was a waiter who'd brought the wrong order. Sarah was still staring into her oatmeal like it contained the secrets of the universe. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady but carrying a weight that made Sarah look up again. "You're absolutely right, Derek. Times have changed. And maybe it's time I changed with them." I walked out of that kitchen with my head held high, but inside, I was already planning. Because Derek Callahan had made one crucial mistake that morning. He'd assumed that just because I was older, I was weaker. He'd forgotten that I'd survived the death of my wife, built a business from scratch, and raised a daughter as a single father for 2 years after Margaret got sick. What he didn't know was that Robert Mitchell wasn't done fighting. In fact, he was just getting started. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I could hear Derek's voice drifting from the kitchen. "Finally! Maybe now we can have some peace in the mornings." And Sarah's soft laugh that followed, that betrayal cut deeper than his words ever could. But they had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Because at 64, I'd learned something that Derek's business school never taught him. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one everyone underestimates. The war had begun, and they didn't even know it yet. I spent the next 3 days watching. Not the obvious kind of watching that would tip them off, but the patient, methodical observation of a man who'd spent 30 years dealing with customers, suppliers, and employees, learning to read people like instruction manuals. Derek thought he'd won some kind of victory, but all he'd really done was open my eyes to what had been happening under my own roof. The first thing I noticed was the money trail. Every morning after Derek left for his job at Pinnacle Financial Group downtown, I'd watch Sarah pay bills at the kitchen table. Credit card statements, mortgage payments, car loans, and I started recognizing patterns that made my blood run cold. They were living paycheck to paycheck, despite Derek's 6-figure salary and my monthly contribution of $3,000 toward household expenses. But here's where it gets interesting, and if you've ever suspected someone in your family was hiding something from you, you'll want to hear every detail of what I discovered. Make sure you're subscribed because this gets much worse before it gets better. Sarah would spread those bills across the granite countertop like she was playing solitaire with financial disaster. I'd pretend to read my newspaper in the adjacent living room, but I was memorizing every number, every due date, every company name. The mortgage on their house, my house now, too, was $4,800 a month. 2 BMW payments totaling $1,400. Credit card minimums that added up to nearly $800. And that was just the beginning. The real revelation came on Thursday morning when Sarah's phone rang while she was in the shower. She'd left it charging on the kitchen counter, and the name that flashed on the screen made my stomach drop. Mountain Peak Casino. I stood there staring at that phone, watching it ring again and again, and pieces of a very ugly puzzle started falling into place. Derek's late nights. Working. The stress Sarah had been carrying in her shoulders for months. The way they'd both jumped at my offer to move in and contribute to expenses. The expensive dinners out that seemed to happen right after Derek had a good day at work. I'd been writing it off as young people being bad with money, but this was something much darker. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my old friend Marcus Webb, who'd retired from the Denver Police Department 2 years earlier and now ran a small private investigation service. Marcus and I had known each other since high school, and he was one of the few people who knew exactly what kind of man I was when pushed into a corner. "Bobby," Marcus said when I called, his voice carrying that familiar gruffness that came from 30 years of dealing with Denver's worst. "Haven't heard from you since Margaret's funeral. How are you holding up?" I told him everything. The breakfast conversation, Derek's dismissal, Sarah's betrayal, and my suspicions about their finances. Marcus listened without interrupting, the way good cops do, and when I finished, there was a long pause. "You want me to look into your son-in-law?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I want to know who I'm really living with," I replied. "And I want to know what they're not telling me. This is going to cost you, Bobby. And you might not like what I find." "Marcus," I said, looking out my bedroom window at Derek's BMW in the driveway. I've got 1.2 million reasons to find out the truth. Money's not the problem. 3 days later, Marcus called me back. His voice was different this time, heavier, more serious. The kind of tone cops use when they're about to deliver news that changes everything. We need to meet, he said. Not at your place. Somewhere private. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of Lakewood, far enough from their neighborhood that there was no chance of running into anyone they knew. Marcus slid a manila envelope across the worn Formica table, and I could tell by his expression that whatever was inside was going to hurt. Derek Callahan has a gambling problem, Marcus began, his voice low and steady. Not the kind where he loses a few $100s on football games. I'm talking about high-stakes poker, casino nights, sports betting through offshore accounts. In the last 18 months, he's lost approximately $180,000. The coffee in my cup suddenly tasted like ash. How much? $180,000, Bobby. And that's just what I could trace through bank records and credit reports. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were photographs of Derek at various casinos around Denver, credit reports showing maxed-out cards, bank statements with suspicious cash withdrawals, and betting slips from online gambling sites. But the document that made my vision blur was a second mortgage application on the house, my house, for $100,000, filed just 2 weeks ago. He's trying to borrow against the house, Marcus continued. Your house. And here's the kicker. He listed your monthly contribution as rental income to boost their debt-to-income ratio for approval. The magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not only were they using my money to subsidize Derek's gambling, but he was trying to mortgage the roof over my head to feed his addiction. My own daughter was complicit in this, watching him gamble away their future while I unknowingly funded the destruction. There's more, Marcus said, and I wasn't sure I could handle more. Derek owes money to some very serious people. The kind who don't send reminder notices or call customer service lines. I found evidence of at least $40,000 in private debts to individuals with connections to organized gambling operations. The diner suddenly felt too small, too hot. I loosened my collar and tried to process what I was hearing. My family wasn't just financially irresponsible, they were in danger. Real danger. And they dragged me into it without my knowledge or consent. Bobby, you need to get out of that house, Marcus said, leaning forward. These aren't people who care about an old man's monthly social security check. If they decide to collect, everyone under that roof becomes collateral. But as I sat there looking at the evidence of their betrayal spread across the table like a roadmap to hell, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's funeral: clarity. Pure, crystalline clarity about exactly what needed to happen next. No, I said quietly. I'm not running anywhere. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Bobby, Derek wants to play games with other people's money? I interrupted, sliding the photographs back into the envelope. Fine. But he's about to learn that some games have consequences he never imagined. I left that diner with a plan forming in my mind and fire burning in my chest. Derek Callahan thought he was smart, thought he could use an old man's money to fund his addiction, while treating him like garbage at the breakfast table. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. The beauty of being underestimated is that people stop watching you carefully. Derek and Sarah had written me off as a harmless old man, which meant they had no idea I was systematically documenting every aspect of their deception. For the next 2 weeks, I became a ghost in my own home, present but invisible, observing everything while appearing to do nothing. Every morning after Derek left for work and Sarah dropped Tommy at school, I had 3 hours of uninterrupted access to their private spaces. I photographed credit card statements, copied bank account information, and documented every piece of evidence that would later become their undoing. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered Derek's home office wasn't as secure as he thought. The man who'd called me an irrelevant old fool had left his laptop password written on a sticky note inside his desk drawer. Sarah T. 2016. Their wedding year. The arrogance of it still makes my blood pressure spike. Here he was, gambling away their future while literally keeping the password to his financial destruction on a piece of paper next to his checkbook. If you've ever wanted to know how to catch someone who thinks they're smarter than you, pay attention to this next part. And if you're enjoying this story of justice being served, hit that subscribe button because what I found on Derek's computer will blow your mind. His browser history read like a roadmap to addiction. Daily visits to offshore gambling sites, cryptocurrency exchanges to hide money movement, and forums where desperate gamblers shared tips on hiding losses from their families. But the smoking gun was his email account. Dozens of messages from something called Mile High Credit Solutions, loan sharks operating out of a strip mall in Aurora. The most recent email, dated just 3 days earlier, was a final notice. Mr. Callahan, this is your last courtesy reminder. The $47,000 balance on your account is now 60 days overdue. Our collection team will be in contact shortly to discuss resolution options. As you know, we prefer to handle these matters privately. $47,000 to loan sharks. While I was contributing $3,000 a month to keep their household afloat, Derek was feeding money to criminals who would happily break his legs if he missed payments. And Sarah, my Sarah, knew. I found text messages between them where she begged him to just pay them something, and he promised it would all be handled soon. That's when I realized Derek's endgame. He wasn't just gambling with their money, he was gambling with mine. The second mortgage application Marcus had discovered was just the beginning. Derek was positioning himself to drain every asset I had, starting with the equity in the house and moving on to whatever else he could access. But here's what Derek didn't know about Robert Mitchell. I didn't build a successful business by being naive about money or people. Every dollar I'd ever earned was protected by legal structures he couldn't even pronounce, much less penetrate. The house might be in his name, but the mortgage was guaranteed by a trust fund that required my signature on any modifications. My investment accounts were locked behind fiduciary protections that would take years to unravel. And my monthly contributions to their household? Those came with conditions Derek had never bothered to read. I spent the next week consulting with my attorney, Edmund Carver, a sharp-dressed shark who'd helped me structure the sale of my hardware store. Edmund was the kind of lawyer who charged $400 an hour and earned every penny by thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. Robert, Edmund said, reviewing the documents I brought him. Your son-in-law has committed multiple actionable offenses here. The second mortgage application using false information, the misrepresentation of your contributions as rental income, the potential elder financial abuse. We could have him arrested tomorrow. I don't want him arrested, I said. I want him destroyed. Edmund smiled, the predatory grin of a legal shark who just smelled blood in the water. Tell me what you have in mind. Here's what people don't understand about revenge. It's not about anger, it's about precision. Any fool can throw a punch or file a police report. But real revenge requires patience, planning, and the ability to think 10 steps ahead while your enemy is still focused on their next move. My plan was elegant in its simplicity. Derek's gambling debts made him desperate, and desperate people make predictable mistakes. All I had to do was provide him with an opportunity that looked like salvation but was actually a trap that would snap shut the moment he reached for the bait. I started by changing my routine. Instead of staying home during the day, I began taking long drives around Denver, visiting old friends, making appointments with financial advisors. But I made sure to mention these activities to Sarah, casual comments about reviewing my investment portfolio and making some adjustments to my will. The seed was planted. Within days, I could see Derek's behavior changing. He started asking indirect questions about my finances, making comments about how smart investors were moving money into new opportunities, and suggesting we should coordinate our financial planning as a family. Then I played the card I'd been holding since the beginning, the fictional inheritance. You know, I mentioned one evening over dinner, I got a call from my cousin Helen's attorney in Phoenix. Apparently, she passed away last month and left me a substantial inheritance. Something about mineral rights her late husband owned in Colorado. The lawyer says it could be worth anywhere from $800,000 to $1.5 million, depending on current market values. Derek's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Sarah looked up from her plate with genuine surprise. She'd never heard me mention a Cousin Helen because Cousin Helen didn't exist. But Derek's eyes lit up like a slot machine hitting jackpot. "That's wonderful, Dad," Sarah said. "Helen was Mom's cousin, right?" "My cousin," I corrected, weaving the lie with the skill of someone who'd been planning this conversation for days. "Haven't spoken to her in years, but apparently she remembered me in her will. The lawyer wants to meet next week to discuss the transfer process." Over the next few days, Derek's interest in my financial affairs became almost comical. He started bringing up investment opportunities at breakfast, mentioning how smart money was moving into certain markets, and suggesting I might want to diversify my holdings before the inheritance created tax complications. The hook was set. Now all I had to do was wait for him to bite. But what Derek didn't know was that while he was planning to steal my fictional inheritance, I was documenting every step of his real crimes. Every conversation was being recorded on a device Marcus had given me. Every financial document he'd accessed without permission was being logged. Every move he made was being tracked and cataloged for the reckoning that was coming. The breakfast warrior who dismissed me as a fading old man was about to learn that some enemies are most dangerous when they appear defeated. And Derek Callahan was about to discover that underestimating Robert Mitchell was the biggest mistake of his life. Derek took the bait faster than a starving fish in a stocked pond. Within 48 hours of my fictional inheritance announcement, he was practically vibrating with barely contained greed. The man who couldn't be bothered to look up from his phone during family conversations was suddenly my best friend, full of helpful suggestions about managing large sums of money and the tax implications of inheritance law. What he didn't realize was that every word out of his mouth was being recorded by a device Marcus had disguised as a simple hearing aid. At 64, nobody questioned why I might need a little help with my hearing, especially after Derek had spent months treating me like a senile old fool. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday morning when Sarah took Tommy to a doctor's appointment, leaving Derek and me alone in the house. He'd clearly been waiting for this opportunity, because he knocked on my bedroom door within minutes of their car pulling out of the driveway. "Robert," he said, his voice carrying a fake warmth that made my skin crawl. "I've been thinking about your inheritance situation. As someone who works in finance, I'd be happy to help you navigate the complexities." I looked up from the newspaper I'd been pretending to read and gave him the confused, grateful smile of an old man who finally felt appreciated. "That's very thoughtful of you, Derek. I have to admit, all this legal and financial terminology is a bit overwhelming." Hook, line, sinker. He sat down on the edge of my bed like we were old friends sharing confidences. "The thing about large inheritances," he continued, "is that the government wants to take a huge chunk in taxes. But there are strategies, perfectly legal strategies, that can help you minimize that burden." For the next 20 minutes, Derek laid out his plan with the enthusiasm of a con artist who thought he'd found the perfect mark. He talked about offshore investments, cryptocurrency conversions, and something called tax-advantaged private placements. That would require moving large sums of money through accounts he could help me manage. Every word was being recorded. Every illegal suggestion was being documented. And every second of his performance was giving me exactly what I needed to destroy him. But if you think Derek's financial crimes were the worst part of this betrayal, you haven't heard anything yet. Because what I discovered next will shock you to your core, and if you're not already subscribed, you need to hit that button right now because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. That afternoon, while Derek was at work and Sarah was grocery shopping, I received a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was professional but concerned, a woman named Jennifer Walsh from Tommy's elementary school. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I'm calling because we're concerned about Tommy's lunch situation. His account has been overdrawn for 3 weeks now, and when we called the emergency contact number, the phone had been disconnected." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean overdrawn?" "The prepaid lunch account requires a minimum balance to function," she explained. Tommy's account shows a negative balance of $67, and our calls to his parents haven't been returned. We've been providing free lunches through our assistance program, but we wanted to make sure the family was aware of the situation. I was at that school within 30 minutes, checkbook in hand, paying not just the overdue balance but adding $500 to ensure my grandson would never go hungry again. But as I sat in the principal's office, writing that check, a horrible realization washed over me. They were so broke, so consumed by Derek's gambling debts, that they couldn't afford to feed their own child. My grandson, a sweet, innocent 8-year-old boy, had been eating charity lunches for 3 weeks while his father was at home planning to steal my inheritance, and his mother was pretending everything was fine. That's when my plans for revenge shifted from financial justice to something much more personal. Derek hadn't just stolen money and betrayed my trust. He'd neglected his own son while living under my roof and spending my contributions on his gambling addiction. When I got home that evening, Sarah and Derek were in the kitchen preparing dinner like nothing had happened. Tommy was in the living room, playing with toys that looked older and more worn than I remembered. Sarah was stretching ground beef with rice and vegetables, the kind of meal you make when money's tight and payday's too far away. "How was everyone's day?" I asked, settling into my usual chair at the kitchen table. "Oh, you know," Sarah said with forced cheerfulness. "Just the usual routine." Derek nodded, focused intently on his phone. "Busy day at the office. Markets were crazy." Neither of them mentioned Tommy's lunch account. Neither of them acknowledged that their son had been relying on charity while they planned to steal from his grandfather. The casual dishonesty of it, the way they could look me in the eye and pretend their financial house wasn't burning down around them, revealed something darker than simple greed. These weren't desperate people making bad choices. They were predators who'd identified me as prey and were systematically working to drain every resource I had while maintaining the pretense of family affection. That night, I called Marcus with an update on the situation. "It's worse than we thought," I told him. "They're not just gambling with their future, they're neglecting their kid while planning to rob me blind." "Bobby," Marcus said, his voice heavy with concern, "you need to be careful. When people get this desperate, they become unpredictable. If Derek realizes you're onto him..." "He won't realize anything," I interrupted. "Because I'm going to give him exactly what he wants." The plan I outlined to Marcus was simple but devastating. Derek wanted access to my money? Fine. I would provide him with an opportunity so tempting, so perfectly designed to appeal to his greed and desperation, that he wouldn't be able to resist. But when he reached for it, the trap would spring shut with the precision of a Swiss watch, and Derek Callahan would find himself facing consequences he'd never imagined. "I need you to help me set up a meeting," I told Marcus. "Something that looks like a legitimate investment opportunity but gives Derek enough rope to hang himself." "What kind of meeting?" I smiled in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to Derek and Sarah's muffled conversation through the thin walls. "The kind where a desperate man makes the mistake that destroys his life." The war was about to enter its final phase, and Derek had no idea that the harmless old man he dismissed was about to become his worst nightmare. Marcus outdid himself. Within 72 hours, he'd created an investment opportunity so perfectly tailored to Derek's weaknesses that it might as well have had "trap" written across it in neon letters. But greed, as I'd learned during 30 years of business, has a way of making smart people incredibly stupid. The setup was elegant. Marcus posed as a representative from Rocky Mountain Mining Ventures, a supposedly legitimate company looking for private investors to fund mineral rights acquisitions in Colorado. The same fictional mineral rights that my equally fictional cousin Helen had supposedly left me in her will. The beautiful symmetry of it made me appreciate Marcus's devious mind even more. The meeting was arranged for a Friday afternoon at an upscale coffee shop in downtown Denver, public enough to seem legitimate, private enough for Derek to reveal his true intentions without worrying about witnesses. I played my role perfectly, the confused old man who needed help understanding complex financial matters and was grateful for his son-in-law's expertise. Derek arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in his most expensive suit and carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He'd spent the morning researching mining investments online, trying to sound knowledgeable about an industry he knew nothing about. But what he lacked in knowledge, he made up for in pure, undiluted greed. Marcus, playing the part of investment advisor James Morrison, was a masterpiece of controlled professionalism. Gray-haired, wearing a conservative suit, with business cards from a website he'd created overnight and references from shell companies that existed only on paper. To anyone who wasn't looking too closely, and Derek definitely wasn't looking closely, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be. "Mr. Mitchell," Marcus said, shaking my hand with just the right amount of deference. "Thank you for coming. And you must be Derek, the financial advisor Sarah mentioned." Derek practically glowed with self-importance. "That's right. Robert asked me to help evaluate this opportunity since large investments can be complicated for someone unfamiliar with current market conditions." The condescension in his voice was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Even in a meeting about my money, Derek couldn't resist talking down to me. But every word was being recorded by devices Marcus had planted throughout the coffee shop, and every insult would become evidence in the case I was building against him. And folks, if you think Derek's arrogance was shocking, wait until you hear what he proposed when he thought he was talking to a legitimate investor. Make sure you're subscribed because this conversation will make your jaw drop. Marcus laid out the investment opportunity with the skill of a professional con man, which, given his police background, he essentially was. The mineral rights supposedly left to me in Helensville could be leveraged to purchase additional rights in the same geological formation. The initial investment requirement was $300,000, but the projected returns were substantial, potentially $2 to $3 million over 3 to 5 years. "Of course," Marcus continued, "we understand that moving that much money requires careful planning. There are tax implications, transfer requirements, and timing considerations that need to be handled properly." Derek leaned forward, his eyes practically glowing with avarice. "What kind of timing are we talking about?" "The opportunity is time-sensitive," Marcus explained. "We need to close on these properties within 30 days, or they'll go to another buyer. That means any interested investors need to have funds available quickly." This was the moment of truth. Derek could have suggested I consult with my own attorney, take time to research the company, or consider the risks of such a large investment. Instead, he did exactly what I'd predicted. "Robert," Derek said, turning to me with fake concern, "this sounds like an incredible opportunity, but you're right to be cautious about moving so much money quickly. What if there was a way to bridge the gap? Something that would let you secure the investment now while your inheritance goes through probate?" I played the confused grandfather perfectly. "What do you mean?" Derek's smile was pure predator. "Well, I have access to short-term financing through my firm. We could provide the initial investment capital now, then when your inheritance is processed, you could repay the loan and keep the profits. It would cost a small fee for the bridge loan, but the returns would more than justify it." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if this were a reasonable suggestion instead of a transparent attempt to steal my money. "That's an interesting approach. What kind of terms would your firm offer?" And here, folks, is where Derek revealed exactly what kind of man he really was. What he proposed next wasn't just theft, it was a systematic plan to drain every asset I owned while leaving me responsible for debts I'd never agreed to take on. "My firm can provide up to $500,000 in bridge financing," Derek said, his voice smooth as silk. "The terms would be simple. Robert signs over power of attorney for the investment, we fund the purchase, and when the mineral rights start producing income, we take our fee off the top. It's a win-win situation." Power of attorney. He wanted legal control over my finances, using money I didn't actually have as collateral for an investment that didn't actually exist. It was so audacious, so perfectly designed to give him access to every dollar I owned, that I almost admired the scope of his ambition. But the beauty of Derek's plan was also its fatal flaw. By proposing to use his firm's money for a fraudulent investment, while obtaining power of attorney through deception, he just committed multiple felonies, all recorded on devices that would stand up in court. That sounds complicated, I said, maintaining my confused grandfather act. Are you sure this is all legal? Derek's reassurance was swift and confident. Absolutely. This kind of bridge financing happens all the time in the investment world. My firm handles these transactions regularly. The paperwork is straightforward, and the legal protections are built right into the contracts. Every word was another nail in his coffin. Every lie was documented evidence. Every fraudulent promise was being captured for the reckoning that was coming. The meeting ended with Derek practically vibrating with excitement, convinced he just orchestrated the perfect crime. Marcus gave me business cards and promised to send over the investment documents within 48 hours. Derek shook hands with both of us, already calculating how much of my money he'd be able to steal before anyone realized what was happening. As we walked out of the coffee shop together, Derek couldn't contain his enthusiasm. Robert, this could be life-changing for all of us. You're looking at potentially millions in returns, and the risk is minimal since we're using professional financing. I nodded along, playing the grateful old fool who was lucky to have such a smart son-in-law looking out for his interests. But inside, I was calculating exactly how much prison time Derek was facing for what he'd just proposed. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all that remained was watching Derek Callahan destroy himself with his own greed. Derek spent the weekend in a state of barely controlled excitement, pacing around the house like a caged animal who'd just spotted an unlocked door. He'd taken the bait so completely that he was already spending money he thought he was about to steal. Saturday morning, I watched him browsing luxury car websites on his laptop. By Sunday afternoon, he was showing Sarah pictures of vacation homes in Aspen. What he didn't know was that Marcus and I had spent those same 2 days preparing the final act of our performance. The investment documents Derek was expecting weren't just fake. They were legal landmines designed to explode the moment he tried to use them. Monday morning came with an unexpected twist that almost derailed everything. Derek announced over breakfast that he'd taken the day off work to handle some important business with me. Sarah seemed surprised but pleased that he was showing so much interest in family affairs. That's wonderful, she said, squeezing his hand across the table. Dad, you're so lucky to have Derek helping you with all this complicated financial stuff. The irony was so thick it was choking me. My daughter was praising the man who was planning to rob her father blind, while I sat there playing the grateful victim of his upcoming crime. But here's where the story takes a turn that will shock you. If you think you know how this ends, you're about to be surprised. Hit that subscribe button because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. The call came at 9:47 a.m. I was in my room, preparing for Derek's inevitable request to review the investment documents, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Tommy's school again, and my heart immediately sank. What now? Mr. Mitchell, this is Principal Davis. I'm sorry to bother you again, but we have a situation with Tommy. What kind of situation? He's in my office right now, and he's been asking to speak with you specifically. He seems distressed. He said he needs to tell his grandfather something important about his daddy. The world seemed to stop spinning. Tommy wanted to talk to me about Derek? An 8-year-old doesn't request private meetings with adults unless something is seriously wrong. I'll be right there, I said. I told Derek I needed to run a quick errand and would be back within an hour to review the investment paperwork. He was so focused on his impending payday that he barely looked up from his laptop, just waved me away with an impatient gesture. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Principal Davis's office, looking at my grandson's tear-streaked face. Tommy was a tough kid, took after his grandfather in that regard, but whatever was bothering him had broken through that 8-year-old bravado. Grandpa, he said quietly, I heard Daddy talking on the phone last night. He said some bad words about you. What kind of bad words, buddy? Tommy looked at Principal Davis, who nodded encouragingly. He said you were stupid and old, and that he was going to take all your money. And then Mommy started crying, and Daddy got really mad at her. The room felt like it was spinning. My grandson, this innocent child, had overheard his father planning to steal from his grandfather, and had witnessed his mother's breakdown over it. But there was more. Grandpa, Daddy owes money to some scary men. They came to our house when you were at the store yesterday. Mommy made me hide in the closet, but I could hear them yelling. They said if Daddy doesn't pay them, something bad would happen to all of us. Principal Davis's face had gone pale. This wasn't just a family financial dispute anymore. This was a child in potential danger. Tommy, I said gently, did these men hurt anyone? No, but they broke Daddy's golf clubs and said next time it would be more than golf clubs. Mommy was shaking after they left. I spent another 20 minutes with Tommy, reassuring him that everything would be okay and that Grandpa was going to make sure the family was safe. Principal Davis agreed to keep him at school for the rest of the day, giving me time to handle what needed to be handled. As I drove home, my mind was racing. Derek wasn't just a gambling addict trying to steal from an old man. He was a desperate debtor whose actions were putting my grandson in danger. The loan sharks weren't content to wait for Derek's elaborate scheme to pay off. They wanted their money now, and they were willing to threaten a child to get it. The game had changed completely. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about protecting my family from a man who'd brought criminals to their door. When I walked back into the house, Derek was waiting for me with a stack of papers spread across the kitchen table. His fake investment documents, power of attorney forms, and loan agreements, everything he needed to legally steal every dollar I owned. Perfect timing, Robert, he said with that oily smile. I've reviewed everything, and this deal is even better than we thought. All we need to do is sign a few documents, and you'll be set for life. I sat down at the table and looked at the papers. They were professionally printed, legally formatted, and completely fraudulent. Derek had spent considerable time and effort creating documents that would transfer my assets to accounts he controlled while leaving me responsible for debts that didn't exist. This looks very complicated, I said, maintaining my confused grandfather act. Are you sure this is all legitimate? Absolutely, Derek replied. Look, I know it seems overwhelming, but that's why you have me to help navigate these waters. The important thing is that we need to move quickly. The investment window closes tomorrow. As he explained each document, pointing out where I needed to sign, I made my decision. Derek Callahan was going down, but not the way I'd originally planned. This wasn't going to be a slow, methodical destruction of his life through legal channels. This was going to be swift, decisive, and devastating. Derek, I said, picking up the pen. Before I sign anything, I need to ask you something. Of course. What is it? I looked him directly in the eyes, those cold blue eyes that had dismissed me as irrelevant just weeks earlier. Do you really think I'm that stupid? The change in his expression was immediate and complete. The fake concern disappeared, replaced by the calculating look of a predator whose prey had just revealed it wasn't helpless after all. I don't know what you mean, he said carefully. I mean the $47,000 you owe to loan sharks. I mean the fake investment documents you spent all weekend creating. I mean the gambling debts that force you to bring criminals to a house where my grandson lives. Derek's face went white, then red, then white again. Robert, I think there's been some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, I interrupted, was thinking you could steal from me without consequences. I pulled out my phone and pressed a button. Marcus's voice came through the speaker, clear as a bell. Denver Police Department, Detective Williams speaking. Derek's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. The investment meeting had been a setup. The inheritance was fake. And every word he'd said, every crime he'd proposed, had been recorded and turned over to law enforcement. Derek Callahan, Marcus continued through the phone. You're under arrest for attempted elder financial abuse, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. We're outside your house right now. The sound of car doors slamming and footsteps on the front porch punctuated his announcement. Derek looked around the kitchen like a trapped animal, his carefully constructed plan crumbling around him in real time. But the story doesn't end there. Because what happened when the police walked through that door revealed a truth about my daughter that I never saw coming. The front door opened before the police could knock, and Sarah walked in carrying grocery bags and wearing the expression of a woman who knew exactly what was about to happen. She wasn't surprised to see Derek pale and panicked at the kitchen table. She wasn't shocked by the police cars in the driveway or the sound of officers approaching the house. She was relieved. "Thank God," she said quietly, setting the bags on the counter. "I was wondering when someone would finally stop him." Derek spun around in his chair, his mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. "Sarah, what are you talking about? You need to tell them this is all a misunderstanding." "No," she said firmly. "It's not a misunderstanding. It's over." The police entered through the front door, Marcus leading 2 uniformed officers and a detective I didn't recognize. But what happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life, and if you think you understand family loyalty, you're about to learn something that will change your perspective forever. Sarah turned to me with tears streaming down her face and said, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have stopped this months ago." "Sarah," Derek hissed. "Shut up. Don't say another word." But my daughter, my brave, broken daughter, had apparently been waiting for this moment longer than I'd realized. "Derek's been forging Dad's signature on documents for 3 months," she told the detective. "Loan applications, credit card authorizations, even a reverse mortgage inquiry. He made me help him by providing personal information about Dad's finances." The detective pulled out a notebook while Marcus began reading Derek his rights. But I was focused entirely on my daughter's confession, trying to understand how deep this betrayal really went. "He threatened to leave Tommy and me with nothing if I didn't cooperate," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "He said the gambling debts were my fault because I hadn't been supportive enough of his investments. When the loan sharks started coming to the house, he told me it was either help him steal from you or watch them take everything we had." Derek was handcuffed now, being led toward the front door, but he was still trying to control the narrative. "She's lying!" he shouted. "Sarah, tell them you're lying! Tell them about the inheritance." "There is no inheritance, Derek," Sarah said quietly. "There never was. Dad told me the whole plan 3 days ago." The room went silent except for the sound of Derek's world completely collapsing. He looked at me with an expression of pure hatred, finally understanding that he'd been played by the old man he dismissed as irrelevant. But the revelations weren't over. As the officers prepared to take Derek away, Sarah pulled a manila envelope from one of her grocery bags. "Detective," she said, "you'll want to see these. They're copies of all the documents Derek asked me to help him create. Bank statements he altered to inflate our income, fake employment records, forged signatures on loan applications. I kept copies of everything." Marcus took the envelope, and I could see from his expression that Sarah had just provided enough evidence to put Derek away for a very long time. As Derek was led out of the house in handcuffs, he turned back and looked at me one last time. "You think you've won, old man? This isn't over. I'll be back, and when I am—" "No," Marcus interrupted. "You won't be back. Not for 7 to 10 years if you're lucky." The front door closed behind them, leaving Sarah and me alone in the kitchen with the wreckage of our family scattered around us like debris from an explosion. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly. Sarah collapsed into a chair, her composure finally breaking completely. "Known what? That Derek was stealing from you? That he'd been forging documents? That he owed money to criminals? All of it, Dad. I've known all of it." The betrayal cut deeper than Derek's theft ever could. My daughter had watched him plan to rob me blind and had even helped him do it, but she'd also been documenting his crimes and waiting for the right moment to stop him. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "Because I was ashamed," she sobbed. "Because I was terrified. Because Derek convinced me that if I said anything, we'd all lose everything. He showed me what those loan sharks did to other families who couldn't pay. Pictures, Dad. Horrible pictures." The complexity of the situation was staggering. Derek had been both the perpetrator and the victim of his own schemes, dragging Sarah and Tommy into a web of debt and fear while systematically planning to destroy me financially. Sarah had been both his accomplice and his victim, helping him commit crimes while secretly working to stop him. The breakfast, I said, understanding flooding through me. When Derek humiliated me and you didn't defend me. I was recording it, Sarah interrupted. The whole thing. Derek had been getting more abusive toward you for weeks, and I knew someone needed to document it. I couldn't defend you in the moment because I was afraid he'd stop talking and we'd never get him on tape. She pulled out her phone and showed me a recording app with dozens of saved files. Conversations between her and Derek about his gambling. Phone calls with loan sharks. Arguments about money and threats about what would happen if she didn't cooperate with his schemes. I've been building a case against my own husband for 2 months, she said. But I didn't know how to approach you without Derek finding out. When you started acting strange, taking all those meetings, asking questions about finances, I thought maybe you were onto him. I was, I admitted. But I thought you were part of it willingly. Sarah's face crumpled. Dad, I would never steal from you. Never. Yes, I helped Derek with some of the paperwork, but only because he convinced me it was temporary. He said once his luck turned around, he'd pay everything back and we could pretend none of this ever happened. The tragedy of it all was overwhelming. Derek had manipulated everyone, Sarah through fear and threats, me through his apparent contempt, even Tommy by creating an atmosphere of tension and financial stress in the household. He'd turned family members against each other while systematically working to destroy us all. But there was still one more revelation coming, and this one would change everything I thought I understood about the past 3 months. Dad, Sarah said, reaching across the table to take my hand. There's something else you need to know. About Mom's jewelry. My blood went cold. Margaret's jewelry collection, her grandmother's rings, the pearl necklace I'd given her for our 20th anniversary, the diamond earrings she'd worn to Sarah's wedding, had disappeared from the house shortly after she moved in with Derek and Sarah. They told me it was lost during the move, and I'd accepted their explanation despite my suspicions. Derek sold it, Sarah whispered. 6 months ago, when the gambling debts got really bad. He took everything and sold it to a pawn shop in Aurora. I didn't find out until it was too late to get any of it back. That was the moment my heart finally broke completely. Not because of the theft, material things could be replaced. But because Derek had stolen the last physical connection I had to my wife and had made my daughter complicit in covering it up. The war was over. Derek was defeated. But looking at my daughter's tear-stained face, I realized that winning had cost me more than I'd ever imagined possible. 3 months later, I stood in a Denver courtroom watching Derek Callahan receive a sentence of 8 years in federal prison for elder financial abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s named Patricia Hernandez, had reviewed every piece of evidence Marcus and I had gathered, every recording Sarah had made, and every document Derek had forged. Mr. Callahan, Judge Hernandez said, looking down at Derek with barely concealed disgust. Your crimes represent a particularly heinous form of betrayal. You systematically exploited the trust of family members, endangered a child, and showed complete disregard for the safety and security of the people who should have been able to depend on you most. Derek, dressed in an Orange County jail uniform, looked nothing like the arrogant financial advisor who dismissed me as a fading old man. 3 months of incarceration had stripped away his polished veneer, revealing the desperate, broken person underneath. When he glanced back at the gallery where Sarah, Tommy, and I sat, his eyes held no defiance, only defeat. But the courtroom drama was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape our entire family. Because what I learned about myself during those months of planning Derek's downfall was almost as shocking as what I'd discovered about him. The federal prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Amanda Chin, had built an airtight case using evidence I'd provided. But during our meetings, she'd asked me questions that forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my own motivations. Mr. Mitchell, she'd said during one of our preparation sessions, Derek's crimes are clear-cut, but I need to understand your role in this investigation. You could have simply reported his initial theft attempts to police. Instead, you chose to conduct an elaborate sting operation. Why? The honest answer was complicated and not entirely flattering. Yes, I'd wanted to protect my assets and stop Derek from stealing from me. But there was more to it than that. I'd wanted him to suffer the way he made me suffer. I'd wanted him to experience the helplessness and humiliation he'd inflicted on me. He made me feel powerless, I'd admitted. Like I didn't matter anymore. The sting operation gave me back my sense of control. Amanda had nodded understandingly, but her next question cut deeper. And what about your daughter? Did you consider how your methods might affect her? That question haunted me long after Derek's sentencing. Sarah had been trapped between a manipulative, abusive husband and a father whose desire for revenge had required her to maintain a deception that was tearing her apart. My elaborate plan to destroy Derek had forced my daughter to live a lie for months, never knowing whether I trusted her or suspected her of betrayal. The truth was, I'd been so focused on defeating Derek that I'd almost lost Sarah in the process. If you've ever planned revenge against someone who hurt you, you know how intoxicating that sense of control can be. But what you might not realize is the cost that kind of anger extracts from everyone around you. Make sure you're subscribed, because what I'm about to tell you about rebuilding trust after betrayal will challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness. The first real conversation Sarah and I had after Derek's arrest took place 2 weeks later, in the kitchen where this whole nightmare had begun. Tommy was at school, the house was quiet, and we finally had the space to be honest with each other. "Dad," Sarah said, staring into her coffee cup, "I need you to know how sorry I am. Not just for helping Derek, but for not trusting you enough to come to you sooner." I reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm the one who should apologize. I knew something was wrong, but instead of talking to you about it, I assumed you were part of Derek's scheme. I should have trusted you. But I was part of it," she insisted. "I helped him create fake documents. I gave him information about your finances. I stood by and watched him disrespect you because I was too scared to stand up to him." The complexity of the situation was still overwhelming. Sarah had been both victim and participant, manipulated by a master manipulator but still responsible for choices she'd made out of fear. Derek had been both criminal and casualty, destroying his family while destroying himself. And I had been both victim and avenger, justified in my anger but questionable in my methods. "The morning Derek humiliated me at breakfast," I said, "when you didn't defend me, that was the moment I decided he had to be stopped. But it was also the moment I started to doubt you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I was recording everything, trying to build evidence against him. But watching him talk to you like that, seeing the hurt on your face, and not being able to defend you, that was one of the hardest things I've ever done." We talked for 3 hours that morning, unpacking months of deception, fear, and misunderstanding. Sarah told me about the threatening phone calls from loan sharks, the nights Derek would come home drunk and rage about his losses, the constant fear that their family was about to lose everything. I told her about my investigation, about Marcus's help, about the fake inheritance, and the elaborate trap I'd set for Derek. I explained how her silence at that breakfast had convinced me she was complicit, and how discovering the truth about her secret recordings had changed everything. "We both made mistakes," Sarah said finally. "But we also both did what we thought was necessary to protect our family." "Derek thought he was protecting his family too," I pointed out. "That's what makes this so tragic. Everyone was acting out of fear, and fear makes people do terrible things to the people they love." The healing process was slow and complicated. Sarah and Tommy moved out of the house we'd all shared, partly for practical reasons, since she couldn't afford the mortgage without Derek's income, and partly because we all needed space to process what had happened. I helped Sarah find a small apartment closer to Tommy's school and took over paying for his lunch account, his after-school activities, and the counseling sessions he needed to process his father's imprisonment. Sarah found a job at a local insurance company, working to rebuild the financial stability Derek had destroyed. But the most important work we did was rebuilding trust between each other. Weekly dinners became our ritual, where Tommy could talk about his feelings, Sarah could process her guilt and trauma, and I could work through my own complicated emotions about revenge, justice, and family loyalty. 6 months after Derek's sentencing, Sarah asked me a question that changed how I understood everything that had happened. "Dad, do you think Derek ever really loved me? Or was I just another mark in his elaborate con game?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. "I think Derek loved the idea of you, successful, beautiful, connected to a family with money. But I don't think he was capable of loving you as a person. Love doesn't manipulate. Love doesn't threaten. Love doesn't put children in danger to service and addiction. Then what we had wasn't real. The Derek you fell in love with was real," I said carefully. "But the Derek who threatened you, who stole from me, who brought criminals to our house, that was also real. People are complicated, Sarah. They can be genuinely loving in some ways and genuinely terrible in others." As I sat there looking at my daughter, still beautiful, still strong, but marked by experiences that had aged her far beyond her years, I realized that Derek's greatest crime wasn't the money he'd stolen or the documents he'd forged. His greatest crime was making us all question our ability to trust the people we love most. Today, 18 months after Derek was sentenced, I'm sitting in my new apartment, a comfortable 2-bedroom place just 5 minutes from Sarah and Tommy's home, writing this story and thinking about the lessons I've learned about revenge, family, and the price of justice. Derek will be eligible for parole in 6 years. The loan sharks he owed money to disappeared after his arrest, probably moving on to other desperate victims in other cities. The house where we all lived together has been sold, with the proceeds split between paying off legitimate debts and establishing a college fund for Tommy. But the real changes have been internal, and they've forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about the man I became during those months of planning Derek's downfall. The revenge I orchestrated was perfectly legal and completely justified. Derek committed serious crimes that deserved serious consequences. He endangered my grandson, manipulated my daughter, and systematically planned to steal everything I'd worked my entire life to build. A reasonable person could argue that I showed remarkable restraint in using legal channels instead of simply confronting him directly. But revenge, even justified revenge, changes you in ways you don't expect. For months, I was consumed by anger, planning, and the desire to see Derek suffer. I became calculating, deceptive, and willing to manipulate people, including my own daughter, to achieve my goals. In some ways, I became uncomfortably similar to the man I was trying to defeat. The question that haunts me isn't whether Derek deserved what happened to him. He absolutely did. The question is whether the person I became while orchestrating his downfall was someone I can live with being. And if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever felt that burning desire to make them pay for what they did to you, then you need to hear what I learned about the true cost of getting even. Sarah and I have rebuilt our relationship, but it's different now. There's a wariness that wasn't there before, a careful consideration of words and actions that comes from knowing how quickly trust can be destroyed. We love each other, we support each other, and we've forgiven each other. But innocence, once lost, can never be fully recovered. Tommy, now 10 years old, is thriving in ways that surprise me. Children are more resilient than adults give them credit for, and removing Derek's toxic influence from his life has allowed his natural personality to emerge. He's funny, curious, and surprisingly wise for his age. When he asks about his father, Sarah and I tell him age-appropriate truths, that Daddy made some bad choices and has to live somewhere else for a while, but that he's still loved and none of what happened was his fault. The financial damage has been largely repaired. Insurance covered some of Derek's fraudulent activities, and the federal restitution order will eventually recover additional funds, though Derek obviously has no money to pay right now. More importantly, the legal structures I'd put in place to protect my assets worked exactly as designed. Derek never actually succeeded in stealing anything significant, despite months of trying. But the emotional damage, to Sarah, to Tommy, to me, that's something money can't fix. I've spent the last year in therapy, working through my own anger and examining the choices I made during this crisis. My therapist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, helped me understand that while my desire for justice was natural and justified, the methods I chose revealed some troubling aspects of my own character. "Robert," she said during one of our sessions, "you talk about Derek's manipulation and deception like they were foreign concepts to you. But look at what you did to catch him. You created an elaborate false reality, manipulated multiple people's emotions, and orchestrated a complex deception that lasted for months. How is that different from what Derek was doing?" The difference, I argued, was that my deception served justice while his served greed. I was protecting my family while he was destroying it. My lies had a moral purpose while his were purely selfish. "That may be true," Dr. Martinez replied, "but the fact remains that you proved yourself capable of the same kinds of manipulative behavior that you found so reprehensible in Derek. What does that tell you about yourself?" "It tells me that any of us, under the right circumstances, can become someone we never thought we'd be. It tells me that the line between justice and revenge is thinner than we'd like to believe. It tells me that righteous anger, even when it's truly righteous, can corrupt us if we're not careful about how we channel it. Most importantly, it tells me that the real victory wasn't sending Derek to prison. It was rebuilding the relationships he'd damaged and creating a healthier environment for Tommy to grow up in." Last month, Tommy asked me a question that crystallized everything I'd been thinking about. "Grandpa, are you glad Daddy went to jail?" It would have been easy to say yes. Derek deserved imprisonment. His absence has made our lives immeasurably better. Tommy is safer, Sarah is healthier, and I no longer have to watch my back in my own home. But the honest answer was more complicated. "I'm glad you and your mom are safe," I told him. "I'm glad the bad things your daddy was doing have stopped. But I'm not happy that a family got broken up, even when it had to happen." Tommy thought about that for a while, then said, "I think Daddy was sick in his brain, like when people have cancer in their bodies. Maybe jail will help him get better." The wisdom of children never ceases to amaze me. Tommy had found a way to understand his father's actions without excusing them, to hope for his recovery without minimizing the damage he'd caused. Derek writes letters sometimes, to Sarah, never to me. She shows them to her therapist, but rarely reads them herself. He claims to be getting treatment for his gambling addiction, says he's found religion, promises he's a changed man who deserves another chance. Maybe he is changing. Maybe prison and therapy and the loss of everything he valued will transform him into the man Sarah thought she'd married. Maybe someday he'll be capable of being the father Tommy deserves. But that's not my concern anymore. My concern is the family I have now, a daughter who's rebuilding her life with courage and determination, a grandson who's growing up to be a remarkable young man, and the relationships we're all working to strengthen every day. The hardware store I owned for 30 years is now a chain restaurant. The house where Margaret and I raised Sarah has been renovated by strangers. The life I thought I'd live in retirement, quiet, comfortable, surrounded by family who respected and appreciated me, that life is gone forever. But the life I have now isn't worse, just different. I'm more careful about trust but not cynical about people. I'm more aware of my own capacity for darkness but not ashamed of the choices I made to protect my family. I'm older, more scarred, but also more honest about who I am and what I'm capable of. To anyone watching this who's dealing with betrayal from someone they trusted, let me tell you what I wish someone had told me. Revenge might satisfy your anger, but it won't heal your heart. Justice might stop bad people from hurting others, but it won't undo the damage they've already done. The only thing that truly heals betrayal is time, forgiveness, and the hard work of building something better from the wreckage of what was destroyed. Derek Callahan taught me that people aren't always what they seem, that trust once broken can never be completely restored, and that even family members can become enemies when desperation takes control. But Sarah and Tommy taught me something more important, that love is stronger than betrayal, that families can survive even the worst violations of trust, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well despite what others have done to you. If this story moved you, if it helped you understand something about your own family situation, or if you just want to hear more stories about real people dealing with real problems, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that even the worst betrayals can be survived. Because at 66 years old, I've learned that life isn't about avoiding pain, it's about choosing what to do with the pain that inevitably comes. And the choice I've made is to use my experience to help others navigate their own dark moments with wisdom instead of just anger. Derek may have taken 3 years of my life, but he couldn't take my future. And that, more than any legal victory, is the real triumph of this story.